Go ahead and take out your notes number 63. Today we're going to be talking about common ancestry. Common ancestry. You probably heard of the word ancestry somewhere, maybe on TV or in your science classes in middle school or elementary. Your ancestors are people related to you back in the day. So what we're going to be talking about today is how different organisms are related to one another. For example, why is it or how is it that humans are closely related to chimps? Most scientists believe that all forms of life can trace their origins back to a single common ancestor. So if you look at this tree right here, in blue you have bacteria, in red you have archaea, in brown you have eukarya. So scientists believe that bacteria, archaea, and eukarya are linked somehow together through this common ancestor right at this point. And right after this point, it starts to branch out into their own organism. So bacteria, archaea, and eukarya right here. So on number 1, what do most scientists believe all life can be traced to? And the answer is in yellow, common ancestor. Common ancestor is number 1. Scientists can show the relationships between different species by using something called a cladogram. If you look at this picture on the left, this right here is a cladogram. Or they can use a phylogenetic tree, something like this. Okay, this is a phylogenetic tree. Both of these instruments show these relationships in a very similar way. On number 2, what tools do scientists use to depict or to show the relationships between different species? And the answer, cladograms and phylogenetic trees is number 2. Cladograms and phylogenetic trees. Different species that are more closely related have a much more recent common ancestor. On number 3, what is true of closely related species? And the answer is in yellow. Recent common ancestor is number 3. They have a recent common ancestor. So in order for scientists to understand the relatedness between organisms or figure out whether or not organisms are related is by looking at evidence. So scientists use evidence that they uncover in fossils, studying biogeography, and investigating homologous structures to draw conclusions about the relatedness of organisms. So on number 4, what do scientists study that lets them draw conclusions about the relatedness of species? So they can draw conclusions from fossils, studying biogeography, and homologous structures. That is all for number 4, what I have underlined. Number 4, fossils, biogeography, and homologous structures. Those are the 3 different types of evidence scientists use to determine how related organisms are. So let's talk about what fossils are. Now, fossils are preserved remains of organisms. So sometimes whenever organisms die, what happens is their bones are preserved in the ground. So because the bones are preserved in the ground, scientists can dig up these bones and look at the structure of these dead organisms and see how are they related to organisms that are living today. So, for example, a paleontologist is a person who digs up fossils. So what they do, organisms that are fossilized are normally organisms that are extinct, for example, like dinosaurs. So scientists can use the bones from a dinosaur and compare it to organisms that are living today and see how are they related or how are they different. Number 5, what do we call the preserved remains of an organism? And the answer is a fossil. That is number 5. Number 6, moving on. What do we call a species that no longer has living members? If they are no longer existing, that is called extinct. Number 6, the answer is extinct. Right there. Extinct. That's number 6. The study of fossils has led many scientists to theorize that birds can trace themselves back to a common ancestor that was a dinosaur. Number 7, what do scientists believe was a common ancestor of all birds? And the answer, dinosaurs. That's number 7. We just got done talking about fossils. Let's move on to the next type of evidence that scientists look at. Let's talk about homologous structures. So homologies are similar structures in different species that were derived from a common ancestor. Remember, the prefix homo means same. Okay, just in case you forgot, homo means same. So these homologous structures are studied to determine the relatedness of species. On number 8, what are homologous structures? They are similar structures in different species. That is number 8. Similar structures in different species. Alright, so if you look at the picture at the very top, let's look at this color one right here. Here you have the arm of a human, the leg of a dog, the wing or the arm, wing, whatever, of a bird, and the fin of a whale. So if you look at these 4 different limbs of an organism, the colors correlate to similar structures in each of those organisms. For example, if you look at each of these limbs, everything that's in red here are very similar. So here in a human is similar to that of a dog, a bird, and that red one in a whale. Same thing with the yellow part. What's colored in yellow, they are very similar to one another. So because of these homologous structures, these similar structures, scientists believe that there was a common ancestor that led to all of these different types of organisms having similar structures, homologous structures. What's in red is the same, what's in yellow is the same, what's brown is the same, what's this cream color is the same structure. So although they have similar anatomy in their limbs, they use their limbs for different purposes. For example, humans, us, we use our arms to pick up stuff. As for a dog, they use their limb to walk around or to run. We don't walk on our hands, do we? And for birds, they use their limbs to fly. And for a whale, they use their limbs to swim in the ocean. So, even though their structures are very similar to one another, they do something different. They have a different purpose. So, however, it is similar structure that shows common ancestry, not the function, not what it does. It is the structure that is what determines common ancestry. On number 9, what gives evidence for common ancestry? Is it structure or function? And the answer, it is structure. That is number 9. Structure. On your notes, I also have the same picture that is on this slide right now at the very bottom of your notes. That way you can memorize what homology means. All right, go ahead and turn to the back of your notes. Number 10. What process increases the diversity of functions in those limbs? And that is natural selection. That is number 10. Natural selection. So depending on their environment and what those organisms have to adapt to in order to survive will determine what the function of those limbs will be. For example, we do not live in the ocean like the whale, okay? So their limb should be adapted to living in the ocean, swimming in the ocean. Homologies can also appear in the molecular structures of organisms. For example, what are molecular structures? That is DNA and proteins. So scientists can look at organisms' DNA and proteins and compare them to other organisms to see whether or not they are related. You have the same exact table on your notes as well. So go ahead and look at the DNA base sequence of a human, chimp, and gorilla. While you are looking at that, I want you to figure out, pause the video after I ask this question, which one of those organisms, a chimp or a gorilla, is closely related to the human? Is it the chimp or is it the gorilla? At this time, go ahead and pause this video. So in order to determine which of these is most closely related to the human, you got to look at the DNA. So in the human, this is the sequence of its DNA, and here's the chimp and the gorilla. Now, if I compare the human and the chimp together, let's see how many differences there are. I'm going to use this pink color in order to circle the differences, okay? So, in the very beginning, so far, AGG the same. Very good. Humans, CAT, but chimp is CCC. So, I'm going to circle that. That's a difference. Let's look at the third codon. The human has 3 A's, AAAA, whereas the chimp has CTT. So that's a different one too. So I'm circling all the differences. Now the next codon, CCA, same, and same. So they only have a total of 2 differences between one another. Now let's compare the human to the gorilla. So AGG, that's the same. CAT, but the gorilla is CCC, so that is a different. I'm going to circle that one in purple. Okay. And then the third codon, AAAA, and then the gorilla is CTT, so that's different. CCA, same. ACC, same. GAT, AGG, now that's a different one. And the last one, TAA, CCA. So that is also different. So there is a total of 4 differences. So, therefore, the human and the chimp are most closely related. Human and the chimpanzee are most closely related because they only have 2 differences. Number 11. What molecules are studied for homologies? And the answer, DNA and proteins. That is number 11. DNA and proteins. 2 species are more closely related when their molecular structures are more alike, just like the human and the chimpanzee. The species which are more alike most likely have a more recent common ancestor. So, on number 12, if the molecular structures of 2 genes or proteins are very similar, what does this imply? What does this tell you? And the answer is in yellow. More recent common ancestor. That's what they have. Alright, so we're still talking about homologies, what structures organisms have in common. So, different species can also display homologies in their development. Human embryos, before you were even looking like a human, okay, in your mother's belly. Human embryos have gill slits and tails. What? And this suggests that humans have a common ancestor with other animal species that still have these traits. So today on Earth, you see animals that have gills. Who has gills? Those are fish, okay? Who has a tail? There are many organisms that have tails. For example, like a tiger has a tail. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can see all of these little embryos, okay? So you have an embryo of a hog, which is a pig. You have an embryo of a calf, that's a baby cow. You have an embryo of a rabbit, and then you have an embryo of a human. If you look at the embryos, the different stages, so here is stage 1 of each of these embryos. Stage 2 of a hog, calf, rabbit, human, and stage 3 of the hog, calf, rabbit, and human, okay? Stage 1, look at that. They look so similar. Isn't that crazy? Obviously, we do not look like a pig or a calf or a rabbit. Maybe some of us do, but if you look, we are very different from a pig, a cow, or a rabbit. But yet, at stage 1 of our development, look how similar we look to one another. You cannot tell which one's a pig, which one's a cow, which one's a rabbit. You cannot. And then as you move to stage 2, we still look pretty similar to one another. Very pretty similar, okay? And then as you get to stage 3, you still look very similar. Very similar. If you notice, if you look at the tail, that's where we start to lose our tail there. Okay? But overall, class, the embryos look so similar. You cannot tell who is who yet. Pretty interesting. So anyways, back to our notes, number 13. What do human embryos have that adults do not? And the answer's in color there. You got before we were born, when we were embryos, we used to have gill slits and tails. That is number 13. Gill slits and tails. Number 14. What does this imply or tell you about humans and other members of the phylum Chordata? So just like I said, all of these organisms here, their embryos look so similar to one another. That just means scientists believe that we share a common ancestor with these organisms. So number 14, have a common ancestor. Number 14, have a common ancestor. Alrighty, so we're moving on to the next type of evidence, and that is biogeography, okay? Just some of y'all may have taken geography class before, and that's learning where everything is on the globe, okay? So biogeography is the study of the distribution of species around the earth. So by studying the species that live in an area now and in the past, scientists can study how species have changed and how they might be related. On number 15, what is the study of the distribution of species on Earth? And the answer is biogeography. That is number 15, biogeography. So by studying all of these organisms on each part of the earth, scientists noticed, like whenever they study the fossils, those fossils provided evidence that the continents were once joined together in a supercontinent called a Pangea. And you've probably heard of that word before, Pangea, and that's the answer to number 16. And Pangea is just one big supercontinent. So in the field of biogeography, it has realized, it has identified several large geographic regions that are separated from each other by geographic boundaries like mountains, ranges, broad deserts, or oceans. So if you look at this map up here, class, you can see these different zoogeographic regions. You have this color here, this region here, and this lighter blue, and in this green, and in this mint color, you got this Australian continent in this pink color. So each of these different color represents a zoogeographic region. Number 17. What do we call a region where species are separated by geographic boundaries? And the answer is zoogeographic regions. Number 17. Number 18. What are some geographic boundaries that can separate these regions? The answer, mountains and broad deserts or oceans. That is number 18. Number 18, mountain ranges, broad deserts or oceans. So in these zoogeographic regions, in these different colors here, species in a region are isolated from one another. They are separated from one another, okay? And they have been able to become adapted to their own region over a long period of time. So a really good example are kangaroos. Where are lots of kangaroos found? They are found in Australia. Why is that? Because kangaroos are more well adapted to the climate or the environment in Australia. So if we were to place it maybe in Texas or something, it may not be very well adapted and they could possibly die. So the only times you see kangaroo in Texas is probably in a zoo. On number 19, what is true of species in each region? They are adapted to their own region. So number 19, adapted to their own region. Number 19. Alrighty, moving on. Charles Darwin. Y'all know his name. Y'all know who he is. Y'all better know who he is. You should have learned him in middle school or elementary, one of those two. So number 20. Who first proposed the theory of evolution? That's the man named Charles Darwin. That's number 20. So this man studied the distribution of finches. Finches are birds, okay, on the Galapagos Islands. Darwin concluded that from the different species came from a common ancestor, and the differences between the species were a result of natural selection. So on number 21, Darwin studied the finches, which are birds, found on what island? It's on the island of Galapagos. Galapagos Island is number 21. Galapagos. So whenever Charles Darwin traveled to each of these different little islands, he noticed that these birds of finches they looked very similar. However, their beak sizes were a little different. You got large beaks, you got tiny beaks, you got thinner beaks, you got wider beaks. So as he traveled through each of these islands, he noticed the differences in beak shape and size. So on number 21, Darwin concluded that all of the species of finches had evolved from what? And that is a common ancestor. So number 22, the answer is common ancestor. Number 22, common ancestor. Number 23, what process did Darwin believe had created the differences in the finches? And that is natural selection. Is in green, natural selection. Number 23, natural selection.